Hi guys, so welcome to another video. In this video, we are going to learn about functions in Swift. So I made a template to describe what kind of functions you can write. So let us go one by one and we will see how you can write functions in Swift. So first thing is like functions without any params. Like these type of functions are very simple functions. So for an example, in Swift, you write function with a keyword called func. So you write func and then name of your function. So let's say I want to name this, say hello world. And you open the parentheses and close the parentheses to say that this function doesn't take any arguments. And then you start the curly brackets and close it. So this would be the body of the function. This is the func keyword. This is the name of the function. This parenthesis says that this function doesn't take any arguments. And this block would be the body of the function. And inside the body of the function, we will do what is required in that function. So this function says, say hello world. So let me print hello world here. And so this is the body of the function. So whenever you call this function, it will print this hello world. So let's try to call this. So to call a function, you just type its name and then open and close parentheses. As you can see, we printed hello world as expected. So to call a function, you are saying you are typing its name and then you open the parentheses and you close the parentheses. So that's how you call a function without any params. So if you don't understand the params here, like we will see that later. So now let's see that. So we will see a function with a param. So let's say we have a function. So we'll again type func to denote that we are writing a function. And name of the function, this time we will say greet and then open parentheses and close parentheses. And inside the parentheses, what we want to have is we want to have a param. So what we can say is name colon and string. So what we are saying is this function greet takes a parameter called name, and the type of this parameter is a string. And again, so you open the curly bracket and close it to denote the function body. So you have func keyword, name of the function, the name of the parameter that this function takes, and that's we are calling it just name, and colon, and the type of this parameter. So what type is it? So this function is taking name, but its type is not an integer, it's not double, it's a string. So this function is taking a string as the parameter. And once we take this string name as parameter, we can use this inside the body of the function. So this time we will print a greeting message to the name of the person that we took as parameter. So we will say print. Print is nothing but a function. As you can see, that function takes an argument of a string that will be printed on the console. So we can say welcome, and now we will use this name parameter. And to use a variable or constant inside a string, you have a special notation to indicate that you want to print the value of that variable or constant within that string. So you say backslash and open parentheses, close parentheses, and here you write name. So what it will do is it will generate a string with the name of the parameter printed after the welcome. So currently you can see it's printing the say hello world result here. But now let's call our greet function. And for the name, we will pass my name Pawan. And you can see it prints welcome Pawan. So what we are doing here for calling this function is we are typing its name and open parentheses, similar to what we did before in say hello world. And then we close the parentheses, and inside the parentheses we type the name of the parameter it takes and colon, and then the actual parameter, the string that you want to pass. So I want to pass Pawan as a string. And once you do that, this Pawan string is available within this name parameter. So when you try to print the welcome name inside the body of the function, what gets printed is welcome Pawan. Okay, so let's move on to the next example. So we have function with return value. So currently we have seen functions with a name and that may take a parameter. But what about a function that can return something? So for that, so let's begin writing func keyword, and this time we will return some value from this function. So we can say greet, and we will pass name as the parameter as before. And to return a value from this function, what you do is you do a space and then a dash and arrow to denote that this function returns something. And that's something you type here. So we will return another string. This time you don't have to pass this label for the string. You're just saying that this function will return some string. And then you open the body of the function. And similar to before, you will use this name to return a new string from this function. So to return the string, we will say return, and we will return a string, welcome, and similar to what we did earlier, backspace parentheses to use the name that was passed to our function. And this time, this string will be returned from the function instead of getting printed with the print statement. So what we're doing is we are using this keyword return and returning this string as the returned value of the function that we denoted here. So let's call our new function. We'll say greet, and we'll use this this definition, second definition of the function that returns a string, and we will pass again for one. Maybe we will pass, let's say, some other name, Shravan. So as you can see, like the Xcode reports that ambiguous use of greet name because it is not able to differentiate between this greeting that doesn't return anything but takes the same parameter, and this function that returns a string but takes the same parameter. Because body of the parameter remains the same, so the signature remains the same. So Xcode is confused that which function you mean. So let's try storing some the return value that we get from this function. So you can say welcome message is equal to greet name that we are passing. Sure. Still, Xcode is complaining that it cannot differentiate between these two functions. And this is the limitation in Swift, that it cannot differentiate between two functions just because of the return type. Just because the return type is different, because the calling portion of the method is identical. So this greet here and this greet here is same. So that's why let's change our function's name to get greet message. Because this time we are not going to, so this function greet used to print the welcome message, but this time what we are doing is we are not printing the welcome message. We will get the greeting message as the return of the function. So you call so here you call get greet message with the name Shravan, and this string will be returned from this function and will be saved in this constant welcome message that we have here. So we say let welcome message, that's a constant, equal to whatever value this function will return. So that returns a string that is welcome Shravan. Shravan is passed from here to the parameter. And let's print this value, welcome message, so we can see it on the console. Okay, so as you can see, like we are when we print this welcome message, you can see welcome Shravan is printed, and that is returned by this get greet message function that we have written. Now let's move on to this next part, function with multiple return values. So what currently you see that we are returning just a string from this function, but what we can do is we can also return like two things from this function instead of just one string. So let's say we want to write a function that takes an array and returns a minimum value from that array and maximum value from that array. So we will say func to denote that we are writing a function, and then we will name our function min max. That will take an array. So in the parentheses, we say we are taking an array, and colon the type of the thing that you are taking. So that is an array. So instead you denote array by this open and close braces. And inside the braces, you type the things that array will contain. And we are going to have a array of integers. So you denote it like inside the braces, you say int. So that means like we are creating an array that will hold integers. And from here, you will return two values instead of just one. So you say inside the brackets, integer and comma, another integer. So instead of returning just one integer or a string, what you're doing is you're returning two values from this function, and then you open the curly braces to write the body of the function. So inside the function, what we can do is we can get the minimum element from that array. It will say array.min, and we can get max element from this array. So we can write array.max, and we can now return these two elements. So we will return a tuple again. So this is called a tuple of integers, meaning it has multiple integers coupled together. So we have two integers, tuple of two integers. So what we will return is min element, comma, max element. It says cannot convert return type of integer, integer, optional to return type of integer and integer. So what we see here is the array could be an empty array, right? So if it's empty array, the minimum function will return nothing. It will return nil because there is no element. So minimum element is nothing. That would be nil. So nothing is represented by nil in the Swift language. So it will contain nil. And similarly, max element will also be nil because there are no elements in array. So to handle that case, what we have to say is, what we can do is like if you pass an empty array, we will return a nil value instead of the tuple itself. So for that, what you can do is in the tuple, you can put a question mark afterwards to say that this tuple could exist or may not exist. So it could be the tuple or nil. And then you can have a check. So in check to see if the array is empty. So instead you say guard and condition. Condition would be, is our array empty? And guard says that array should be not empty. And if it is empty, else part, then we will simply return nil. So nil is representing this question mark, meaning we don't have a tuple to return. We will just return nil. So nil is a special keyword in Swift to denote nothing. So if array is not empty, then we will evaluate minimum and maximum element. But if it is empty, then we will return nil. So now we know like our array will not be empty. So what we can do is we are sure that we will find a minimum element, and if array has just one element, we will get a minimum value of that element and maximum value as that element. So we can unwrap that minimum element and maximum element. To unwrap a value in Swift, you say exclamation sign. So what we are saying is this min element can be nil and max element can also be nil because this function minimum can return nil. So it returns an optional like this. So currently min element is nothing but int question mark, and max element is nothing but int question mark, because it could be an int or it could be nothing. But because we have said that array cannot be empty and we are sure that it will be an int, it cannot be nothing. So what we can do is we can unwrap this min element by this exclamation mark to say that we just want the int value. We will ignore all optionals, all nil values. So let's try to use our function min max, and we will pass an array 1, 2, 3. Now this min max will return a tuple of integers. So what we can do is we can store them. So we can say let min max equals to min max array. As you can see, export says that value of optional type int optional must be unwrapped. So what we are returning from here is a tuple of integers that can be nil also. So that's what's denoted by this optional. To unwrap, so because we just want to use the tuples that are returned from here, and we want to ignore these nil values. So if we don't find the min max, we're gonna ignore it. So to say that in Swift, you say if let min max is equal to the function that we have made, and we are passing this 1, 2, 3 array. And if that happens, so we will start a curly braces body. So we say that if we are able to get this min max, that is like we have gotten this tuple instead of nothing, we will print them. So we can print min, comma, max. So as you can see, we are printing 1 and 3. So 1 is the minimum element and 3 is the maximum element. We can add more element to see it works. Added 5. So now 1 is the minimum and 5 is the maximum. So in the above topic, I also covered this function with optional return value because we made the function return a tuple, but also it can return a nil value. So that's why we used this optional. So it is optional on the tuple. So we have covered this function with optional return value already. Function with implicit return type. So one nice feature that Swift provides is you can have an implicit return statement inside a function. So for example, you can have a function func. So we can take just another function that we have already written. So let's say we have this function get greet message. So we have our old function get greet message that takes the name and returns a string, and we are returning welcome and the name. I'll comment this out so it doesn't conflict with our new definition. So we have this func keyword and the name of the function get greet message, and that takes a name and returns a string, and we are returning welcome name. So what we can do is we can drop this return from here and we can just write welcome name. So that's the return type. That's the string that we are returning from the function. But because we only have one line, we don't need to tell Swift that this is a return statement. Swift can automatically infer that it is supposed to return string, and you only have one line in the function body. That's the function body. So it must be the return statement. So that's what like implicit return value means. So let's call this function to test it out. We'll call it Sherman again. And then because we are returning a string, so we have to print it too. So we can pass this function directly into the print function to print the value what is returned by this function. As you can see, it returns welcome Sherman. So that's how you can drop the return keyword from the function body if you only have one line in the function. Next up is function with argument labels. So you see this function has a label called name. But in Swift, you can also have more descriptive function names with argument labels. We will create a function similar to the one that we created earlier. We will say greet and name of the person, and that would be a string. And we will take another parameter that would denote the place where that person comes from, and that would also be a string. And we will simply print our welcome message, say welcome name of the person from, and then place. And let's call this function. We'll say greet name Tim, place Cupertino. So if you read this function call, we write the name of the function, the first parameter it takes, the name of the person. Again, the second parameter that it takes, place, and the actual place string that we're passing. So currently it reads like greet name place, but it doesn't sound like English. It sounds like some coded word. So to make it sound like just an English statement, we use something called argument label. So what we can improve? So what we can say is so what if it sounds like greet name Tim from place Cupertino? That sounds more natural. So what we can do is in the function, we have the name, two parameters, but in the second parameter, we will have one more. We can say from, and that would be our argument label for the second parameter. And the parameter name will still be place. And inside the function body, we will be using the place as the parameter. But when you call this function, you don't use the parameter name now. You will use the argument label. So you will use from in place of place. So it reads like greet name Tim from Cupertino. It's quite close to sounding like English, but this name creates problem. So what we can do is so before name, we can have an argument label underscore. So what underscore says is we have an empty argument label for this parameter. And so what we can do is we can just remove this parameter altogether. But the parameter name will still be used inside the body of the function. But when calling this function, we don't have to use any argument label for this parameter. So we just say greet Tim, that would be the name of the person, and the second argument label from, and the place that we want to pass. So now it reads like greet Tim from Cupertino. So that's quite close to English, and that's how argument labels should be designed to make the call site read like English statement. And it still prints welcome Tim from Cupertino. So our function works like expected, but now working with this function is really easy and understandable. So next topic is function with omitted params. And this topic is actually already covered because we omitted this name parameter with an empty argument. So you don't have to type the parameter when calling this function. Now let's see function with default param values. So for example, let's write a function called serve coffee. And it takes the number of coffees to be served. That would be an integer. So it takes an integer param called number. And we will write the body as print served number coffee. But so let's try to call this function. We'll say serve coffee. Say we say 5. Now it's printing served 5 coffee. Let's say copies. But what if we did not pass this parameter at all? We just say serve coffee. But because when we defined this function, we had said that it has to take a number, and that's how we can call it. But what if we defined a default number of coffees that needs to be served if customer doesn't give you the number of copies? So let's say you say 1 as the default number. So whenever someone calls serve coffee and they don't pass any parameter at all, just simply open parentheses and close parentheses, we still that function still works and it prints served 1 coffee, because we have said that this number parameter, that's an integer, has a default value of 1. So that's denoted by equal to 1. So if you don't pass any values, the value of the number would be 1. And you can still pass the number parameter, say 5, and it will print served 5 copies, because now the value of the number is 5 instead of default value 1. Now let's see what are function types. So just let's see the previous function. We have the serve coffee function. If you want to know the type of this function, what type of function is this, you can see the number of parameters it takes, and you can see what kind of parameters it takes. We see that it takes 1 integer parameter. So to denote the type of the function, we say this parentheses. So what params it takes. So inside the parentheses, we say the type of the first param it takes, and that's the only param for this function. And then we say dash arrow and what it returns. So this function is not returning anything. So if it's not returning anything, we say void. So this is the type of this serve coffee function. It takes an integer, it takes the number of coffee, and it returns nothing. So with this type information for this function, what you can do is you can store this function in a variable or constant. So we can say let serve coffee function equals to serve coffee. And we don't have to call that function, but we can. So Swift is smart enough to infer the function type. So as you can see on the right side, it has inferred integer and it returns nothing. But you can also say that as the type of the function. So in Swift, like you denote the type of a constant or variable by saying colon and the type of the thing that it is. So for comparing it to the other variables or constants, we'll say let name and type is a string and the value is a 1. So you can see the similarity. We declare constant name here. We declare constant serve coffee function here. And this name is of type string. And this function is of type, it takes an integer and returns nothing. And we are assigning this function to this variable. So it's similar to the string and any other types. And as you can see on the right side, void can also be written as just empty parentheses. But like I generally prefer to keep it void. But if you have a function that doesn't take anything, so let's say we have this function, right? Greet, no, this one, say hello world. So it takes no parameter at all. So if you want to denote that, you can just delete this and say empty parentheses and then returns nothing. So it takes nothing, it returns nothing. And currently it says an error because serve copy function is not of type that takes nothing and returns nothing. So because serve copy takes an integer and returns nothing. So that's type mismatch. So instead of serve copy here, we can say hello world. And this type will match because say hello world takes nothing and returns nothing and can be stored in this function. We have to anyway change the name of the function. The next one is passing functions as arguments. So let's create a function called add to ints. So this function will take two integers, let's say a and so this function will take two integers. First would be a, let's call it a, and then would be an integer. And second parameter would be again an integer. And it will return another integer that would be the sum of the two integers. So we will just return a plus b. As you can see, I don't need a return keyword here before this because it's just a single line inside the function. So we can drop the return as we seen earlier. And let's make another function. We'll say multiply this time. Multiply two ints. And again, we'll take a as the first parameter. That would be an integer. B as the second parameter. That would be again an integer. And we'll again return an integer. And this time we will return a multiplied by b. Now, what we can do is we can create another, a third function called math function. And this math function can take another function as argument. So in the argument, we will take a function and the type of that function would be something that takes two integers and returns another integer. And then we will have a body of this for this function. So if you look closely here, this is exactly how we write other functions. But this time, the first parameter for this math function is again a function itself. And we, as we have seen earlier, function types can be declared like this. So the things that they take and the return value that they give, based on that, we can create the type of the function. So this parameter is of type a function that takes two integers and return an integer. And we have created these two functions, as you can see here, that take two integers and return an integer. So that means this math function can take one of these two functions as the parameter function. And then what it can do is, and it can also take two of its own integers. So we'll say a, that would be an integer, and b, that will again be an integer. And this function will also return an integer. So what we have here is this math function takes a function as the first parameter and two integer values as second and third parameter, and itself returns an integer. And before proceeding further, so we can let's try calling our two functions to see how they can add numbers 1 and 3. And we would want to print the result. So we will put them inside a print statement and multiply two numbers, and we will have 3 and 4. And let's comment out this one so you can see the results of in the console. And we can see it has added 1 and 3, that's 4, and multiplied 3 and 4, that's 12. And to simplify further, what we can do is we can use argument labels. So we don't have to have this parameter because add two numbers is self-explanatory. It doesn't have to have a and b here. So we can use empty argument labels. So we can omit these params altogether. Similarly, in the multiply, we will omit the argument and make it very simple to use. So multiply two ints, 3 and 4, add two ints, 1 and 3, and it gives us 4 and 12. Now let's uncomment our math function. Now what we can do is we can just use the function that was passed and supply the a and the b parameter to it. What will be the return value will be returned as an integer. So again, I'm dropping the return keyword here because it's just one line. Similarly, what is done here and here. Now let's call our math function, and we are going to pass add two ints, and then we are going to pass this time like 5 and 6, and let's print it. So as you can see here, we are getting 11. That's the sum of 5 and 6. And in the math function, we have passed a function as the parameter, that is add two integers that we had declared earlier, and two parameters for it to execute. So inside this math function, it will take this function as the parameter and call this function, that is add two ints. Add two ints function will be stored in this function parameter. So when you call this function parameter, it is actually going to be this function add two ints, and we are feeding our a and b, these two parameters, in this function add two ints. So as you can see, we made a function, math function, that takes a function and takes two parameters and call this function that was passed with these parameters and returns a result. That would be again an integer that we are printing. Again, similar to this, instead of add two ints, we can say multiply two ints. We don't need the arguments. So when you say multiply two ints, it multiplies these numbers 5 and 6. That would be 30. So that's how you use function as parameters, as arguments to another function. Let's move on to next topic. That is returning other functions from a function. So let's say you have two functions. Have a function. Let's say you have a function called step forward, and that takes an integer. We will say that takes an integer number, called number, and it returns an integer, and that integer will be nothing but number plus 1. So we step forward. And similar to this, we will have another function called step backward. That will take a number, and then it will return that number minus 1 to step backward. Now what we can do is we can have another function let's call this choose step function, and it will take a parameter called backward. That would be a boolean. That can be true or false, and depending on that boolean, we want to return a new function, either step forward or step backward. So we need to declare that we need to put the type of that function here. So as you can see, the type of the function is something that takes an integer and returns an integer. So we will return a function that will take an integer and return an integer. And as the body of the function, we will return either step backward or step forward, depending on this backward variable. So we will switch on this backward. So if the backward is true, we are going to return step backward function. And if it is not true, we are going to return step forward function. And we are able to return these step forward and step backward functions because this function, choose step function, returns a function. So now what we can do is we can make a function called move nearer to 0. And then we can call our choose step function. And depending on a condition, we can move either forward or backward. So let's say our current value is 5, and we want to move towards 0. So we can say if our current value is greater than 0, then we want to move backward. So when you say current value is greater than 0, our current value is 5, and 5 is greater than 0. So it will pass true to this parameter backward. So this bool value backward will be true here. If it's true here, we are going to return the step backward function. So move nearer to 0, in this case, will become the step backward function. Now what we can do is we can write while current value is not equal to 0, we can keep calling move near to 0 function and store the value in the current value. So as you can see, we had this current value as 5, and we are saying that while this current value is not equal to 0, we are going to move nearer to 0, and whatever is the value, we are going to store that in the current value. And this move nearer to zero will be one of these functions, either step forward or step backward. And it needs the number as the parameter. As you can see, Xcode says it's missing a parameter, that's integer. So what we are going to say is we're going to pass this current value to move nearer to zero. So our current move nearer to zero function will return step backward function, and it will take the current value as the number and decrease one from it and then store into the current value. So our current value will keep decreasing. So finally, if we print our current value, it should be zero. As you can see, it is zero. But if you print it before this loop, it should be 5. So as you can see, so with this move nearer to zero function, we are able to decrease our current value to 0. And if it was -5, as you can see, we still move to 0 because we have defined a new function called move nearer to 0. That is a choose step function that can return either step forward or step backward depending on the current value that we have. So if we have -5, choose step function will return step forward function. And when we do that, move nearer to 0 and passing the current value will step forward and till it becomes 0. So that's how you return a function, either step backward or step forward, from another function. So you have this another function that takes some parameter, and then this function returns another function. So this is very useful. As you can see here, you made a new function that has completely different behavior than these isolated functions, step forward, step backward. And because of this ability of returning a function from another function, we have made another function called move nearer to 0 that has really different behavior that we wanted. Okay, let's move on to nested functions. So nested functions is nothing but having functions inside another function. So in our previous example, so we will explain this in our previous example only. So in our previous example, what we could have done is because nobody's calling step forward and step backward here. See, it's all choose step function, and that is the move nearer to 0 function. So what we can do is we can move these functions inside this choose step function, because step backward or step forward are not going to be called by anyone except this choose step function, like this. So now it says missing return keyword here because we have multiple lines, not just a single line. So we have to use the return keyword now. So that's what nested functions do. So you don't expose these functions for outside use, but only this choose step function will define these two functions internally. And depending on this parameter that was passed here, it will either return step backward or step forward, one of the internal functions of this function. So that's how you use nesting of functions to keep some functionality private to other functions. Yeah, that was all for today. I hope you guys liked it. If you liked it, hit the like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to keep getting quality content like this. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.